The quiet suburban streets of Willow Creek had always been the picture of order and routine. Every home featured neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and perfectly pruned hedges. The Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining an image of calm perfection, a world where every blade of grass, every garden gnome, and every fence adhered to exacting rules. To outsiders, it seemed idyllic. To residents, it was a place where rules could be wielded as weapons by the sharpest, most controlling neighbors. Karen Whitmore was that neighbor. She had lived in Willow Creek for over a decade and had taken it upon herself to become the self-appointed moral compass and aesthetic judge of the entire community. She patrolled her front porch like a sentry, her eyes trained on every visible lawn, driveway, and backyard from dawn to dusk. Trash cans left out for an extra hour, a slightly crooked garden flag, or a single sun hat left on a patio chair could trigger her fury. To her, the rules were sacred, and she considered it her duty to enforce them mercilessly. For the most part, Karen's neighbors endured her scrutiny quietly. They adjusted their schedules, maintained immaculate lawns, and spoke softly to avoid attracting her attention. But when Jake and Emily moved into the Whitmore-adjacent property, Karen discovered a threat unlike any she had faced before. Jake was the kind of homeowner who lived for weekends spent outdoors. He loved grilling, entertaining friends and family, and hosting backyard parties filled with laughter, music, and the irresistible smell of smoked meats. To Karen, this represented chaos, noise, disorder, and a blatant disregard for the neighborhood aesthetic. Their first barbecue occurred on a warm Saturday afternoon. Jake had set up a modest grill in his backyard, a few folding tables with snacks, and a string of soft lanterns for ambience. Children played quietly on the lawn, neighbors waved politely from afar, and the air was filled with nothing more than friendly chatter. To anyone else, it was an ordinary suburban gathering. To Karen, it was a full-blown assault on her orderly world. By mid-afternoon, Karen had already begun documenting the offense. She photographed the grill, the tables, and even the lanterns she claimed violated neighborhood rules. She wrote notes in a small leather-bound notebook and, with the precision of a seasoned general, drafted a formal complaint to the HOA. Her complaint was fierce, citing unauthorized outdoor gatherings and disturbances to the visual and auditory harmony of Willow Creek. When the HOA sent a notice to Jake and Emily a few days later, it was brief but menacing. They were informed that their backyard barbecue violated community standards and could not continue without prior written approval. The language of the notice implied immediate repercussions if ignored. For Jake and Emily, it was a shock. They had moved to Willow Creek for the peace and charm of the community, not for a lifelong feud with an overzealous neighbor. Jake reviewed the HOA handbook carefully, page by page. He noted every clause about property usage, outdoor gatherings, and homeowner rights. While Karen had assumed her complaint was a guaranteed victory, the handbook told a different story. The rules allowed for temporary gatherings on private property as long as they did not exceed a certain decibel level and were contained within the homeowner's boundaries. It was vague, open to interpretation, and nowhere did it explicitly limit social events or grilling activities. More importantly, Jake discovered a little-known amendment regarding adjacent property utilization for overflow or event accommodation. This clause allowed homeowners to extend temporary activities onto neighboring common areas with proper notification and permission, an area the HOA rarely enforced because most residents never attempted it. In other words, Jake could legally expand the area of his event, even onto Karen's lawn, if done correctly. The idea sparked a plan. Jake didn't want a mere confrontation. He wanted to highlight the absurdity of Karen's constant meddling, to expose the board's inability to act logically, and to reclaim the community's sense of fairness, all without breaking a single rule. The following week, Jake prepared. He measured distances, reviewed property maps, and drafted polite notices to the HOA explaining his intent to hold a weekend barbecue, fully within the temporary event clause. His preparation was meticulous, down to the exact placement of tables, tents, and even a small stage for music, ensuring that all elements were compliant with the handbook. Meanwhile, Karen continued her surveillance. She assumed Jake would retreat, fearing fines or reprimand. She watched from her front porch, binoculars in hand, fully confident that this newcomer would yield. But as the weekend approached, she noticed subtle changes. The tables were arranged in odd patterns, and faint outlines suggested that the setup extended slightly beyond Jake's usual property boundaries. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Jake and Emily began setting up the event with quiet efficiency. Guests arrived, cheerful and oblivious to the brewing storm. From her vantage point, Karen squinted at what she thought was a minor infraction. Yet the more she watched, the more impossible it seemed to reconcile her assumptions with the legality of Jake's actions. By late afternoon, the entire neighborhood could see it. The barbecue was not only thriving within Jake's backyard, but had expanded gracefully onto the lawn immediately adjacent to Karen's property. Tables and tents were arranged in perfect symmetry, carefully placed so as not to damage any plants or structures. The lawn was now shared, legally, with a flourish that no one expected. The lanterns, the grill, and the music were all positioned within compliance. Neighbors whispered as they passed by, astonished that the infamous Karen's lawn had been quietly included in the gathering without complaint. Karen herself appeared at the edge of her property, fuming and disoriented. She tried to assert her authority, but every attempt was blocked by Jake's careful adherence to the handbook. The irony of the situation was impossible to miss. The very lawn she had obsessed over for years had become a stage for her own humiliation. Entirely within the rules. That moment, it became clear to the neighborhood that things were changing. Karen's reign of fear, bolstered by obsessive rule enforcement, was no longer absolute. Jake had discovered a way to navigate the labyrinth of HOA regulations and turn the tables, exposing the fragility of her control. For the first time, residents felt a glimmer of hope that reason and fairness could prevail. And so the barbecue continued, vibrant and legal, right on the edge of the infamous Karen Whitmore's territory, leaving everyone, especially her, stunned, speechless, and forced to reconsider what control really meant in Willow Creek. The aftermath of the first expanded barbecue left Willow Creek buzzing. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, first by whispers over backyard fences, then by hesitant smiles and nods during morning walks. For years, residents had avoided conflict, silent victims of Karen Whitmore's relentless enforcement of HOA rules. But now, everyone had witnessed something extraordinary. A homeowner not only following the rules but bending them in a way that highlighted their absurdity, all while remaining perfectly legal. Karen's shock was palpable. She stood rigidly at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, as if she could physically restrain what was happening. The vibrant tables, the neatly arranged tents, and the gleaming grill sat partly on her territory and partly on Jake's. Yet not a single regulation had been broken. Her eyes darted nervously to every detail, searching for something, anything, that she could claim as a violation. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. The man had read the handbook, planned meticulously, and executed flawlessly. Her years of perceived authority were crumbling before her very eyes. Neighbors began approaching Jake with quiet admiration. Older residents who had endured years of petty fines, subtle threats, and whispered complaints quietly congratulated him. Some couldn't help but laugh at Karen's stunned expression. Children ran freely, blissfully unaware of the tension, weaving through tables and lanterns while adults observed the unusual calm triumph over rigid control. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting, summoned by Karen herself, eager to reclaim control. The usually timid board members shuffled into the community hall, papers in hand, faces tight with concern. Karen delivered a furious recount of the events, expecting immediate action. She painted the scene as chaotic, disruptive, and an affront to the neighborhood's standards. She demanded that Jake be fined, removed from community events, or forced to cease operations immediately. But as the board scrutinized Jake's application and the meticulous placement of the expanded barbecue, they faced an undeniable reality. Every element complied with HOA rules. The temporary expansion onto Karen's lawn was explicitly permitted under the adjacent property utilization clause, provided that property damage was avoided and proper notice given, which Jake had done. The board realized they had no legal leverage. Their authority, long assumed unchallengeable, had been carefully outmaneuvered. Karen's frustration began to morph into desperation. Her usual arsenal of threats, complaints, warnings, fines was useless. Every attempt she made to assert dominance over the situation only highlighted her misjudgment. The neighborhood watched, a mixture of shock and amusement, as she paced the edge of her lawn, muttering to herself while neighbors whispered behind cupped hands. Her authority, meticulously built over years, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Emboldened by the visible support of his neighbors and the evident legality of his actions, Jake decided to escalate strategically. He began planning subsequent barbecues, each more expansive and imaginative than the last, carefully utilizing other overlooked clauses in the HOA handbook. Every move was calculated to remain lawful while further exposing the absurdity of Karen's self-imposed dominion. The following weekend, the expanded gathering returned, even larger than before. This time, tents stretched further across Karen's lawn. A small portable bar appeared in compliance with HOA event regulations, and decorative lights illuminated the entire area in a carefully orchestrated display. Neighbors streamed in, not just for food, but for the spectacle itself. Everyone wanted to witness the slow, inevitable unraveling of Karen Whitmore's control. Karen appeared once more, this time attempting to rally other HOA members and a few like-minded neighbors to intervene. But her attempts were futile. The rules were on Jake's side, and the public support had shifted. The whispers and smiles among the other residents were no longer hesitant. They were open, audible, and unmistakably mocking the visual of Karen's lawn, once her fortress of control, transformed into a stage for celebration and clever defiance. It symbolized the turning tide of authority within the community. What had begun as a single backyard barbecue had become a challenge to decades of unilateral enforcement. Residents felt a sense of empowerment, finally recognizing that the rules were tools to ensure fairness, not instruments of personal tyranny. The board attempted to mediate quietly, suggesting compromises and alternative solutions, but every proposal Jake presented reinforced the legality of his actions. He referenced precise clauses, detailed event guidelines, and previous board precedents that validated the expansion. Every document and reference was checked meticulously, leaving the board without an actionable path to impose restrictions. Meanwhile, Karen's neighbors, once silent observers, began sharing their own grievances. Long-forgotten fines, petty complaints, and arbitrary judgments were brought to light. The conversation shifted from a single barbecue to years of unchallenged enforcement. The community, for the first time, felt unified against overreach, emboldened by Jake's quiet, precise rebellion. By the end of the second weekend, the scene had evolved from mere entertainment into a symbol of resistance. Lanterns glowed warmly across lawns, laughter filled the air, and music played softly under the fading sun. Karen, though still present, had begun to retreat to the periphery, unable to maintain her usual dominance. Her presence was no longer imposing. It was almost tragic, a reminder of control lost and authority undermined. Jake, observing the scene, felt no triumph in personal victory. Instead, he took satisfaction in the restoration of balance. The neighborhood, long suppressed under the weight of an unyielding enforcer, had found a catalyst for change. One barbecue, planned with care and executed with precision, had become a turning point. That evening, as lanterns flickered and neighbors slowly departed, Karen remained on her lawn, staring at the transformed scene. She realized that this was only the beginning. Her influence had been challenged, exposed, and publicly undermined. The momentum Jake had created would not fade with a single weekend. It was a permanent shift, a new chapter in the dynamics of Willow Creek. And as the night settled over the quiet streets, one fact became undeniable. Karen's reign of control had been broken, and Jake had the handbook and his foresight to ensure that it would never return to the way it was. The following week, Willow Creek was a neighborhood transformed. The air carried an energy that had been absent for years, a mixture of cautious optimism and quiet triumph. Residents walked the streets with smiles, nodding at one another, sharing small victories that had been impossible under Karen Whitmore's relentless oversight. Conversations no longer began with whispered warnings or polite reminders to comply with arbitrary rules. They were about unity, enjoyment, and reclaiming the community from unnecessary control. Karen, however, was unrelenting. She patrolled her lawn with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her gaze shifting nervously whenever someone walked by. She could not escape the reality that her carefully cultivated image of authority had been challenged and exposed. Every day, she counted the number of tables, tents, and decorations that now legally encroached upon her property during Jake's carefully organized events. Yet no matter how she tried to intervene, she was powerless. Jake's meticulous adherence to the HOA handbook left her attempts not just ineffective, but publicly humiliating. Jake, aware of the attention and resistance he had inspired, continued to escalate strategically, but never illegally. Each weekend brought a new layer of ingenuity to his backyard gatherings. Portable bars, additional tents, thematic decorations, and entertainment were all integrated seamlessly into his plan. Every expansion was measured, precise, and fully compliant with HOA guidelines. Slowly but surely, the expanded events became a community spectacle. Neighbors who had once avoided one another gathered openly, sharing food, laughter, and admiration for the creativity and legal cleverness on display. The HOA board, still cautious and embarrassed by their previous failures to control the situation, attempted to reassert authority in subtle ways. They proposed minor revisions to the handbook, adding restrictions that seemed, on paper, to target potential infractions. Yet Jake's foresight had anticipated each loophole. Every rule the board tried to impose was met with full compliance, but in ways that further highlighted the absurdity of their previous attempts at dominance. Karen, meanwhile, became the unintended symbol of rigid authority clashing with community freedom. One particularly bright Saturday, the final barbecue event of the season was set up. This time, Jake and Emily had transformed not only their own backyard but a stretch of adjacent open space that included a portion of Karen's lawn, fully permitted by HOA Clause 14b. Colorful canopies, rows of picnic tables, string lights, and a small stage for local musicians created a festival-like atmosphere. Neighbors arrived in droves, their enthusiasm visible in every handshake, laugh, and shared plate of food. Karen appeared at the perimeter, as she always did, her posture tense and eyes scanning every detail. But this time she had no allies. Other residents, once cowed into silence, now observed openly, ignoring her commands and whispering to one another about the beauty and legality of the event. Children ran freely across the lawn, couples strolled between tables, and the music blended with the hum of community life. Karen's authority had diminished to a powerless shadow, a relic of outdated enforcement. Jake watched from a distance, quietly satisfied. There was no gloating, no personal triumph beyond the simple restoration of fairness and balance. The focus of his strategy had never been Karen personally. It had always been about reclaiming the neighborhood from arbitrary control. And as neighbors laughed, danced, and celebrated, it was clear the shift was permanent. The HOA board eventually addressed the situation publicly. They acknowledged the oversight in previous enforcement, clarified ambiguous clauses, and emphasized that homeowners were entitled to reasonable use of their property. The message was carefully worded to avoid embarrassment, but the community understood its true meaning. The rules existed to ensure fairness, not to serve as instruments of personal power. Karen, however, remained isolated. Her repeated attempts to assert dominance had alienated allies, exposed her hypocrisy, and drawn the community firmly to Jake's side. For the first time, she experienced the social consequences of her actions, a reminder that control, when exercised unjustly, could backfire spectacularly. As the evening sun cast golden light across the transformed lawns, neighbors lingered to enjoy the festival atmosphere. Music played softly, tables were laden with food, and conversations flowed naturally. The visual of Karen's lawn, once the centerpiece of her obsessive enforcement, had now become a shared space of community enjoyment. It was the ultimate reversal. The space she had used to impose fear and order now symbolized freedom, creativity, and lawful resistance. Jake, observing the scene, reflected on the broader implications. One barbecue, meticulously planned and legally executed, had sparked a fundamental shift. Residents who had endured years of quiet oppression felt empowered to voice concerns, collaborate openly, and embrace the simple joys of neighborhood life. The dynamic of Willow Creek had changed. Control no longer resided in the hands of one overzealous individual. It was distributed, shared, and moderated by fairness and legality. As dusk fell, lanterns lit up the night, casting warm pools of light across the shared space. Karen retreated into her home, defeated and contemplative, while neighbors continued to linger outdoors, celebrating the subtle triumph of community over control. The neighborhood had been reminded of an essential truth. Authority was only meaningful when it served the common good, not personal obsession. And so, Willow Creek entered a new era. Lawn decorations, barbecues, and gatherings continued within the clear bounds of the HOA handbook, but the spirit of the neighborhood had irrevocably changed. No longer would residents live in fear of arbitrary enforcement. No longer would one person dictate the rhythm of the community. The message was clear. Fairness, creativity, and legal knowledge could overturn even the most entrenched power. The final image of the season remained vivid in everyone's memory. A vibrant backyard gathering, stretching across property lines, lanterns glowing in the twilight, laughter echoing through the streets, and Karen Whitmore, once the enforcer of order, standing powerless as the neighborhood celebrated freedom. It was a story that would be remembered, recounted, and shared for years. A testament to the power of careful planning, legal savvy, and community spirit in the face of overreach.